By the seal of this holy court and the consent of the council, the sentence is pronounced.
Hold still, my lady.
The precious things are no longer yours.
So let it be done.
She was supposed to be a bride, but her wedding became a sentence. Draped in silk and gold, she walked not toward love, but toward her own imprisonment. In the Empire's eyes, her purity was a possession, something to be guarded, tested, and displayed. But for 40 endless days, that purity became her torment. Behind walls carved with devotion and cruelty alike, she was stripped not only of her clothes but of her dignity, her laughter, her will to live. History tells us marriage was sacred, a union blessed by faith and family. But in this forgotten corner of time, it was a ritual of control, where a woman's body proved loyalty through suffering. Her name was erased, her story sealed away. Yet the echoes of her agony remain, haunting the halls of a palace that once called her bride. The empire was built on beauty, marble palaces, golden temples, and an illusion of divine perfection. But beneath the surface of its splendor lived an uglier truth. The women who kept that illusion alive were never free. In this kingdom, purity was not a virtue, it was a currency. A woman's worth was measured not by her wisdom or her heart, but by the stain or absence of one upon her body. The higher her family's rank, the more sacred her chastity became. She did not belong to herself. She belonged to her father, to her husband, to the gods. The empire's priests called it divine order. They said women were born from the rib of man and must return to his command. In sermons that echoed across crowded courtyards, they compared disobedient wives to spoiled fruit, claiming that temptation and sin flowed through the veins of every woman. From birth, girls were taught silence as survival. Their mothers showed them how to lower their eyes, how to smile when broken, how to exist without question. Royal daughters were the most cursed of all. While the poor toiled in fields, princesses lived in cages lined with silk. Their bodies became tools of diplomacy, traded for peace or territory. To preserve bloodlines, kings arranged marriages before their daughters reached adolescence. But beyond the public displays of piety and devotion, there was fear, the fear of dishonor, the fear that a single whisper of impropriety could end dynasties. In this empire, shame was more powerful than swords. If a woman was accused of impurity, her entire bloodline fell with her. Her brothers would lose titles, her father his land. It didn't matter if she was innocent. Perception alone was enough to destroy her. And so, the punishment for temptation became ritualized. A woman accused of desire, even imagined desire, was stripped of her dignity in the name of purification. The laws, written by men and sanctified by priests, gave legitimacy to cruelty. A husband could order his wife confined, beaten, even executed, if he believed she had shamed him. The courts called it restoring honor. No witnesses were needed, no trial required. The empire's religion blessed this barbarity with ceremonies cloaked in incense and scripture. The bride's story began within this web of hypocrisy. She lived in a world where men sinned freely and prayed loudly, while women paid the price for both. The same empire that celebrated beauty demanded suffering from those who embodied it. Publicly, they praised women as symbols of virtue. Privately, they feared their power. In the royal court, whispers carried like wind, about women locked away to atone for imagined lust, about wives paraded half-naked before priests for cleansing, about girls who disappeared after serving as offerings to noble families. Each tale was told in hushed voices, yet each was treated as righteous justice. And when it came to this one bride, the cruelty was disguised as a ceremony. Her punishment would not be seen as torture, but as proof of her family's devotion. When she was locked away, the priests would bless it, the nobles would applaud it, and her husband, the man who vowed to protect her, would turn away in silent approval. This was the empire of shame, a civilization that worshipped purity while feeding on suffering. An empire where faith was used to justify fear, and virtue became a weapon sharper than any blade. It was a place that turned love into sin, desire into death, and obedience into survival. It was here, in this gilded prison of holiness, that one young bride would become a symbol of what happens when a society mistakes control for morality. And when her story began, no one could imagine that her suffering would echo through generations, long after her screams had faded into prayer. She was only 16 when the Empire decided she was ready to be a wife. Her name, once whispered with affection in the courtyards of her home, became property the moment the royal decree was sealed. To her family, this marriage was not about happiness. It was a transaction of status. The groom, a noble twice her age, came from a bloodline closer to the throne. The union was meant to strengthen alliances, not hearts. On the morning of her wedding, the palace glimmered like a jewel. Silk banners waved from the marble columns, musicians played hymns of blessing, and incense filled the air with sweetness that masked the rot beneath. Servants scrubbed every inch of the palace floor as if purifying it for a divine event. The bride sat motionless as maids brushed gold dust into her hair. Her reflection in the mirror showed perfection. Painted lips, jeweled forehead, a veil so delicate it looked like morning mist. But behind the veil, her eyes trembled with quiet fear. Outside, thousands gathered to watch the union. They called it the wedding of the century, a symbol of divine harmony between two great houses. But among the courtiers, whispers slithered like snakes about her youth, her beauty, and the groom's reputation. He was a man known for his temper and his thirst for dominance. Behind the smile he wore for the crowd was a gaze that treated her not as a partner, but as proof of his power. The ceremony unfolded in layers of splendor and ritual. The high priest raised his hands to the heavens, blessing their sacred union in words that echoed like commands. Each vow she spoke was not her own. They had been written for her by others. To obey in all things, she recited, her voice barely audible. To honor and serve. The groom gripped her hand tightly, his fingers pressing into her skin as if to remind her who held control now. The audience saw devotion. She felt imprisonment. When the rituals ended, petals rained from the balconies. The crowd cheered, unaware that beneath the celebration lay dread. The bride's mother wept, not from joy, but from the knowledge that her daughter's freedom had just been buried beneath gold. That night, the palace prepared for what they called the Night of Proof. In the Empire's twisted customs, a woman's virtue was not believed. It had to be tested. Her first night with her husband was to serve as evidence of purity. Maids whispered prayers outside the chamber doors, guards stood watch to ensure ritual propriety, and priests waited for the morning token, the stained cloth that would declare the bride untainted. But when the door closed, what began as silence became terror. The groom's kindness vanished with the last echo of footsteps. His voice, once soft in public, turned sharp as glass. He accused her of looking at another man during the ceremony, of dishonoring him before the gods. She tried to speak, to deny, to plead, but her words only fed his rage. By morning, her chamber was not filled with the laughter of a new couple, but the stifled sobs of a broken bride. The priests came for the proof of purity, and when they did not find what they expected, the whispers began. Some said the groom himself had torn the cloth in anger. Others said he had planned it all, seeking to display his dominance to the court. But it didn't matter which story was true. The Empire only believed one thing, that she had failed the sacred test. As the sun rose, servants avoided her gaze. Her veil, once a symbol of grace, was now a mark of shame. The nobles who had toasted her beauty the night before spoke of her as if she were diseased. The priests declared her soul polluted, unfit for the sanctity of marriage until she was purified. Her punishment would come swiftly, decided not by truth but by ritual. For 40 days, she would be confined in silence, stripped of dignity and mercy, until the gods forgave her imagined sin. In the Empire's chronicles, that wedding was remembered as a moment of divine justice. But for her, it was the day love died before it could even begin. The day gold and silk became chains, and devotion became the weapon that destroyed her. It began with a whisper, a single, poisonous breath carried through the palace corridors before dawn. "The bride is impure," someone murmured, and by the time the sun rose, that whisper had become law. No one asked where the rumor started. No one needed proof. In a world where purity defined worth, accusation alone was enough to destroy a woman. Inside her chamber, the bride sat trembling. Her wedding dress, once a symbol of honor, lay torn on the marble floor. The groom had already stormed out, slamming the door so hard the torches flickered. Outside, servants gathered like carrion birds, pretending to clean while listening for any sound that might confirm the rumor. Some pitied her, others rejoiced. In a court built on envy and deceit, another woman's ruin was entertainment. The groom went straight to the priests, his voice loud, his pride wounded. "She deceived me," he declared, his tone dripping with rage and humiliation. "She entered my bed defiled." The words spread faster than truth could follow. The palace guards were ordered to seal her quarters. Her attendants, once loyal, were dragged away for questioning. The empire's sacred order demanded answers, but only the kind that justified her punishment. In the empire of shame, purity was not just moral, it was political. The bride's alleged impurity stained not only her husband but his entire house. If she were not punished, his enemies could claim weakness, that he could not control his own wife. And so, to protect his honor, he needed her suffering to be public. By mid-morning, the palace court assembled. High priests, nobles, and courtiers gathered like vultures, cloaked in silks and hypocrisy. They spoke of divine justice, but their eyes glittered with curiosity. Her father stood silent, unable to defend her. To question the accusation would mean defying the gods, and no man in the empire dared to risk that. When she was finally brought before them, she could barely stand. Her eyes were hollow, her hair unkempt, her hands trembling against the weight of judgment. The priests demanded she confess, but she had no sin to admit. "I am innocent," she whispered, words so soft they were drowned by laughter. One of the elders stepped forward, his face painted with righteousness. "Innocent," he sneered. "Then where is the proof?" He lifted a cloth, the symbol of purity, stained not with blood, but with accusation. He held it high before the crowd, declaring, "The gods have spoken." The room erupted in approval, as though a verdict had already been written by divine hands. In reality, the gods had said nothing. The groom's pride had, and in this world, his pride was holy. His word was enough to condemn her. Rumors multiplied like insects in the dark. Some claimed she had looked too long at a servant during the feast. Others whispered she had been seen with a court musician weeks before the wedding. Each lie added another brick to the wall closing in around her. The truth, that she was merely a frightened girl on her first night of marriage, vanished beneath layers of fear and superstition. By nightfall, the city buzzed with stories. Women wept in secret, knowing how easily her fate could become theirs. Men spoke of the empire's justice, to assure themselves that control still belonged to them. Even children learned a lesson that day. A woman's virtue could be stolen not by sin, but by rumor. The Queen Mother sent word to the priests, a decree disguised as mercy. "She will be purified," it read. 40 days of isolation, fasting, and prayer will cleanse her spirit. But everyone understood what it meant. Punishment without trial, suffering without reason. When the guards came for her, she did not resist. Her body moved, but her soul seemed already gone. As they led her through the corridors, she passed the wedding hall, now empty, the air still thick with the scent of flowers and wine. The same petals that had once showered her with blessings now stuck to her feet, wet with her tears. Behind closed doors, the council congratulated itself. Honor had been restored, they said. The empire's purity was preserved. No one questioned the cruelty of it, because cruelty in that place was mistaken for virtue. In the chronicles written afterward, the event was reduced to a single sentence. The bride was found unworthy of the sacred bond and underwent purification. But history's ink cannot hide the truth forever. That night, the empire celebrated its justice, while a young woman's life was quietly erased, sacrificed to the altar of pride and superstition. The accusation had done its work. She was no longer a bride, no longer a daughter, no longer even a person. She had become a symbol, a warning carved into silence. Obedience is survival, and innocence is never enough. The judgment came not from a single voice but from a chorus of hypocrisy. In the grand marble hall, filled with incense and trembling candles, the high priest raised his staff and declared her fate. "The gods are merciful," he said. "They do not demand her death, only her purification." The crowd murmured approval. Mercy in this empire meant suffering disguised as salvation. The decree was written on parchment lined with gold. She shall be cleansed of her impurity through 40 days of sacred isolation. She shall eat nothing, speak to no one, and bear no covering before the divine. Those who heard it praised the gods for their wisdom. But behind the words lay a cruelty so deep it could only be hidden under the mask of faith. When the guards came to escort her, she was no longer addressed as bride or lady. She was now the defiled one. Her jewelry was stripped away, her veil torn from her head. The same maids who once dressed her now avoided her gaze, terrified of being accused of sympathy. Her mother tried to reach for her hand, just once, but the priest stepped between them. "Do not touch what the gods have rejected," they warned. The woman's cry echoed down the corridor, but no one dared repeat it. The ritual of humiliation began at sunrise. The priests led her to the cleansing chamber, a small, windowless stone room beneath the palace chapel. Its floor was cold, its walls carved with prayers. The air smelled of candle wax, damp stone, and something older, the scent of other women who had suffered there before her. At the center stood a basin of water and a wooden crossbeam. This was where she would begin her purification. The chief priest recited from the sacred text, his tone steady and righteous. "Before the gods, no deceit may hide beneath silk," he intoned. "The body must stand bare before truth." Servants stepped forward, trembling as they obeyed the command to remove her garments. Layer by layer, they stripped her until nothing remained but her shame. The priests did not look away. They watched, claiming it was duty, though their eyes burned with judgment and curiosity alike. When her last piece of cloth fell, the air in the room grew heavy. She wrapped her arms around herself, but the priest struck the floor with his staff. "Do not conceal yourself before the divine," he hissed. Her body shook, not from cold alone but from the weight of humiliation. They poured water over her head, not to clean her, but to mark her as unholy. The water was icy, mixed with ashes from temple offerings. As it ran down her body, the priest chanted words meant to sanctify. "Let impurity flee, let shame depart." Yet every word branded her deeper with disgrace. When the ritual ended, she was left alone in the dark cell. The door closed with the sound of finality, sealed from the outside. Only a small slit remained, enough for a tray of water and stale bread to pass through once a day. The priest said this was to keep her soul alive for reflection. But in truth, it was to prolong her suffering. The empire called it purification. She called it silence. Each day blurred into the next. The darkness became her companion, her heartbeat, her only sound. At first, she prayed not to be freed, but to be forgotten. Then, as hunger hollowed her and her lips cracked from thirst, even prayer abandoned her. Outside her prison, life continued as if nothing had happened. The groom appeared at ceremonies, praised for his piety. The priests told the people that the gods were pleased by the bride's submission. Her name became a moral tale, spoken in temples to frighten young girls into obedience. Mothers told their daughters, "Be pure, or you will meet her fate." Every element of her punishment was designed not just to cleanse her, but to remind others what happened to women who failed to obey. The room was her tomb, but her story was their warning. And yet, among the servants, whispers persisted. Some said they heard her singing softly at night. Hymns of forgiveness turned into cries for mercy. Others claimed the palace cats gathered near her door, drawn to the scent of despair. The priests dismissed these stories as superstition, but the servants knew better. The empire's purity was built not on holiness, but on fear of women, fear of truth, fear of guilt. By the 20th day, she no longer spoke. Her body weakened. Her hair fell in tangled strands across her shoulders. She traced invisible letters on the wall. Perhaps her name, perhaps a prayer the gods refused to hear. On the 40th day, when the door finally creaked open, the priests entered in silence. The same men who had sentenced her now wore masks of solemn pity. They found her kneeling, barely conscious, her skin pale as ivory. She looked up at them, eyes empty, and whispered, "Am I pure now?" No one answered. They wrapped her in white cloth, not to clothe her, but to bury the evidence of what they'd done. To the empire, her suffering was a triumph of faith. To her, it was the end of everything that made her human. The priests left chanting hymns of gratitude. The empire celebrated its justice. And in the chamber below, the silence she left behind felt louder than any prayer ever spoken. The door closed with a sound she would never forget. A dull, final thud that swallowed all light. Stone met iron, and her world shrank to the size of a tomb. The air was thick, unmoving, heavy with the scent of damp earth and burned incense that drifted through the cracks above her. At first, she thought she could still hear footsteps in the corridor, the faint clink of guards' armor, or the whisper of her mother's voice. But soon even those ghosts faded. All that remained was her breath and the echo of her heart pounding in the dark. The chamber was not meant for living things. It was a hollow square carved beneath the temple, a place built not for punishment but for erasure. No windows, no light, no reflection of time. Only a slit near the floor, just wide enough for a clay bowl of water and stale bread. The walls were cold to the touch, sweating moisture like the skin of the dead. When she placed her ear against them, she could hear faint murmurs from above. Priests chanting prayers of purity, their voices rising like mockery. They called her purification a holy act, but to her, those prayers were nails sealing her coffin. The first night, she tried to count the hours by the rhythm of her breath. She whispered verses she had learned as a child, hoping the gods she once believed in might remember her name. But as the hours stretched into a shapeless silence, her voice began to crack, and even prayer tasted like dust. Hunger came first, sharp, gnawing, familiar. She tried to ration the bread, but the water was always foul, smelling faintly of iron. By the third day, her lips bled when she drank. At times, she thought she could still hear the world outside. The distant chime of bells, the call of the morning prayer, the footsteps of life continuing without her. But as the days blurred, those sounds twisted. The bells became whispers, the whispers became laughter, the laughter became screams. She realized, then, that the only world left to her was the one inside her mind, and even that was turning against her. By the 10th day, she began to talk to the shadows. She gave them names. One was her mother. One was the groom who had betrayed her. One was the priest who smiled as she was stripped bare. They didn't answer, but their silence was kinder than the world's judgment. When she slept, her dreams were of sunlight, golden, warm, unreachable. But when she awoke, the air was so still it felt like she had been buried alive. Sometimes, faint light flickered through the food slit when a guard passed with a torch. It would touch the corner of her cell for a heartbeat, painting her skin in red-orange glow before disappearing. She began to live for those seconds, timing her breaths in the hope she might catch a glimpse of something beyond this endless dark. The prayers never stopped. Each day, priests gathered above her chamber to chant for her soul. "Let her impurity burn away," they said. "Let her return clean." Their words seeped through the cracks in the ceiling, wrapping around her like chains. The irony cut deeper than hunger. Her suffering was their worship, her pain their purity. By the 20th day, her mind began to fracture. She stopped recognizing her own hands, her own reflection in the bowl of water. Once, she thought she saw another woman crouched across the room, a figure with hollow eyes and tangled hair. She whispered to her, begged her to stay. Only when she reached out did she realize it was her own shadow, trembling in the flicker of unseen light. Nights were the worst. The silence wasn't empty. It was alive. It pressed against her ears until she swore she could hear voices whispering from the stone itself. Women's voices, some weeping, some praying, some begging to be remembered. She realized, with a shiver, that she wasn't the first to die here. The walls were thick, but not thick enough to bury memory. On the 25th day, her body began to fail. Her legs refused to move, her skin bruised from the cold stone. She scratched small marks into the wall with her fingernails, one for each day she survived. When her nails broke, she used her teeth. The wall became her diary, her last witness. Then came the hallucinations. She saw her wedding again, the candles, the music, the veil. But in this vision, the guests had no faces. The priest's voice echoed through her head, distorted and cruel. "You are the Empire's reflection. You are its honor." She tried to scream, but the sound wouldn't leave her throat. When she awoke, her voice was gone entirely. The silence had stolen it. The guards outside joked that the chamber was holy because no one ever left it the same. Some never left at all. She heard their words through the door, their laughter muffled but cruel. And still the priests chanted. Still the Empire called her suffering sacred. By the 30th day, time ceased to exist. Day and night merged into a single eternal gray. Her body had become so thin that even the air seemed to pass through her. She stopped marking the walls. There was no point. Every moment stretched endlessly, indistinguishable from the last. And yet, in the strangest twist of fate, she found clarity in her madness. She began to see the Empire for what it was, not a place of devotion, but of fear dressed in faith. Every ritual, every decree, every prayer was a performance meant to hide the truth, that power feared women more than sin itself. And so they caged them, broke them, called it purity. On the 40th day, her silence became absolute. The slit opened one final time, and the torchlight illuminated her frail body. She was kneeling, head bowed, as if still praying. But her eyes were open, staring through the stone. Her lips curved slightly, almost into a smile. Not of peace, but defiance. The guards hesitated. The priests whispered that her soul had been cleansed. They called it divine transformation. But one servant, a girl no older than she had been, swore she heard something before the door shut forever. A whisper, faint but clear. "Tell them, I am still here." And somewhere beyond the walls of the temple, a storm began to rise. Among the faceless crowd of servants who cleaned the halls and carried out the priest's decrees, there was one who could not turn away. Her name was Lyra, a girl no older than 16, with calloused hands and eyes that had already learned to hide fear. She had grown up inside the palace walls, where obedience was the only law and silence the only safety. But when she heard the whispers that the impure bride was being punished beneath the chapel, something inside her stirred. It began with a sound. On her first night assigned to clean the outer corridor, Lyra heard faint scraping from behind the stone door. Not the sound of movement, but of life trying to remember itself. First, she was told to ignore it. "It's just the devil leaving her body," the older maid said. "If you listen, he'll climb into your ears." But Lyra couldn't help herself. She knelt beside the cold wall and pressed her ear to it. The sound came again, soft, trembling, human, a heartbeat. The next morning, when the priest left his usual tray of bread and water by the slit, Lyra lingered. She noticed the bread was hard as stone, the water already sour. Something inside her clenched. That night, when no one was watching, she crept into the kitchen and stole a small piece of fresh loaf, a drop of honey, and a sliver of dried fruit. Her hands trembled as she slipped them into the tray and pushed it through the slit. On the other side, silence. Then the faintest whisper. "Who?" Lyra froze. She had been told the bride could no longer speak, that the gods had taken her voice. But hearing that fragile word, a breath more than a sound, shattered the lies. "I'm no one," Lyra whispered back. "Just someone who can't sleep." From that night onward, Lyra returned when the corridors were empty. Each time she brought a small kindness. A bit of fruit, a folded scrap of cloth, once even a white flower she'd hidden beneath her apron. She never saw the bride's face, only the shadow that moved faintly when the food disappeared. But slowly, the silence began to change. Some nights, the bride would tap softly against the wall. Once for thanks, twice for pain. Lyra responded in the same way. It became their secret language, a rhythm that reminded them both they weren't alone. On the 12th night, Lyra dared to speak again. "They say the gods are watching you," she whispered. Pause. Then, from behind the stone, "If they are, they must be blind." The reply made her chest tighten. Lyra had grown up fearing the priests, their chants, their power. But hearing the bride's quiet defiance, the strength still flickering in a voice that had every reason to break, awakened something she didn't know she carried. Guilt, anger, hope. As days passed, Lyra began to notice changes above ground. The priests grew restless. The high priest scolded the servants more often. "The woman below still breathes," he muttered. "If she is not purified soon, the gods will demand more." The other maids crossed themselves and whispered prayers, but Lyra's stomach turned. She knew what more meant. She wanted to save her. But how does one free someone buried beneath holiness? On the 20th day, she left a note with the bread. "You are not forgotten." When she returned that night, she found a reply written in ash on the cloth she had given. "Then neither are you." It was the only time the bride wrote back. The bond between them was invisible yet unbreakable. Two women caught in a world that saw them as tools, not souls. Lyra began to see the palace differently. The walls that once felt sacred now looked like the ribs of a monster, built to protect power and consume mercy. But mercy, she learned, was dangerous. One evening, as she slipped through the corridor, carrying a small candle and another loaf, she noticed the silence was deeper than usual. The guards were gone. The air felt heavy, expectant. As she knelt to pass the tray, a shadow moved behind her. "Who are you feeding?" The voice was sharp, male, one of the temple guards. The candle flickered in her shaking hand. I was just cleaning," she stammered. He snatched the tray and held it up to the torchlight. The fruit, the fresh bread, the folded cloth, all damning evidence. "The gods do not permit compassion for the condemned," he sneered. "Do you wish to share her fate?" The next morning, the high priest summoned Lyra. She was forced to kneel before him, her head bowed. "You interfered with sacred purification," he said. "Do you deny it?" Lyra's lips trembled, but she did not speak. He leaned closer, his breath cold as marble. "The gods are merciful," he said. "You will not die, but your tongue, the tool of defiance, must be silenced." The guards held her down. Her scream was brief. That night, when the food slit opened again, the tray was empty. The bride waited for the familiar tap on the wall, but none came. Days passed. Silence returned, heavier, darker than before. She didn't know what had happened to the girl who whispered hope through the stones. But sometimes, in the long nights, she thought she could still hear faint tapping, irregular, distant, coming from somewhere deeper beneath the earth. And perhaps that was the cruelest truth of all. The empire could silence voices, bury women, and call it righteousness. But kindness, once spoken, never truly died. It lingered, haunting the darkness, waiting for someone else to listen. The chamber had no clock, no sun, no measure of time. Only hunger and breath to count the living hours. By the 30th day, she had lost both. The bride no longer knew if she was awake or dreaming. Her body had become a stranger to her, a collection of bones that ached and skin that no longer fit. The once silken hair that had been adorned with jewels now came away in clumps, sliding across the damp floor like dead petals. She was supposed to be pure now, cleansed, the priest said, but every breath tasted like rot and rust. Outside the chamber, the empire prepared for celebration. Lanterns hung from every tower, bells rang from the temples, and the priests announced the nearing completion of the Holy 40. The court whispered prayers of gratitude. The Queen Mother, veiled in gold, offered alms to the poor. Her sacrifice, they said, has pleased the gods. None dared to ask what kind of god required a woman's suffering to feel adored. Inside, the air had turned thick, humid, alive with decay. The bride's body trembled without command. Her once delicate fingers now bore open wounds, nails cracked and blackened from clawing the stone walls in delirium. She whispered to herself, names, fragments, memories of a world that had stopped existing. Sometimes she imagined voices through the walls, but the servant's soft tapping had vanished. Even her hallucinations had grown tired. On the 35th day, the priest's chanting grew louder. Their words bled through the walls, heavy and rhythmic. Purity through pain, divinity through obedience. With every syllable, she felt her mind slipping, her name, her family, even her own face dissolving into something ghost-like. She pressed her head to the wall and whispered, "Please, I'm clean. I'm clean." The words echoed back in the hollow chamber, stripped of meaning. Her body began to betray her. Fever painted her skin a ghostly white. Her lips cracked open like dried clay. Her breath came in short, broken gasps. She tried to count the remaining days. One more sunrise, one more prayer. But there was no sunrise to see, no prayer left to believe in. The gods had turned their faces away, or perhaps they had never looked at all. On the 39th night, the empire held a grand feast. Wine spilled across marble floors, musicians played, and courtiers toasted to the purity of devotion. The high priest raised a golden cup and declared, "Tomorrow, the bride shall rise reborn." The irony was lost on them, for as he spoke, the bride below lay half-conscious, her pulse fading like the last flicker of a dying candle. She dreamed, or thought she did, of her wedding day. The music, the perfume, the smiles. Her mother's trembling hand placed the veil over her face. Her brother's voice whispered, "Be strong." The dream twisted. The veil became a shroud. The music turned to chanting. The guests' smiles became masks of stone. She tried to run, but her feet were bound. Then the walls closed in, sealing her in endless night. When the 40th morning came, the temple bells rang again. Not for mourning, but for praise. The priests gathered in the courtyard above, dressed in white, faces glowing with pride. The ritual was complete. "The bride is cleansed," the high priest proclaimed. "Her soul now belongs to the heavens." The crowd bowed. Incense filled the air. But beneath the floor, the truth waited in silence. Lyra, the servant, her mouth now scarred, her voice forever gone, had returned under cover of dawn. She crept into the corridor, trembling, clutching the forbidden key she had stolen days before. The guards were gone, still drunk on wine and sanctity. She fit the key into the rusted lock. It resisted, then turned with a scream of metal. When the door opened, the air struck her like a blow, heavy with rot and incense, death wrapped in holiness. She stepped inside, her candle flickering. The room was smaller than she'd imagined. A stone floor slick with condensation, walls lined with scratches. Not words, not symbols, just desperate marks of existence. In the center, chained to the wall, the bride sat slumped, her body still. Her wedding veil, or what remained of it, clung to her shoulders like cobwebs. Her eyes, half open, stared at nothing. Lyra dropped to her knees, tears cutting through the soot on her face. She reached out to touch the bride's hand, but it was cold, rigid, and feather-light. Outside, the priests began their final blessing. "Let her spirit ascend in purity," the high priest intoned. "Her suffering has been transformed into light." The words floated down through the cracks in the floor as Lyra closed the bride's eyes with shaking fingers. In that moment, she understood the empire didn't worship gods. It worshipped its own cruelty. And every prayer, every ritual, every sacrifice was just another mask to hide its hunger. She looked once more at the lifeless woman before her, the bride who had been punished for existing, and whispered a soundless vow. If the gods would not remember her, the people would. As the temple bells tolled above, Lyra slipped away into the shadows, leaving the chamber door open. The scent of death mingled with incense and rose upward, drifting through the corridors like truth, invisible, undeniable, and impossible to bury again. They buried her at dawn, not in disgrace, but in gold. The priests wrapped her frail body in silk, perfumed it with rare oils, and called it a divine ascension. The empire declared that her 40 days of silence were proof of her sanctity. What had been torture became miracle. What had been murder became a myth. The bride who had screamed in the dark was now praised as a woman of unshakable devotion. Her story was rewritten before the soil could even cover her bones. The royal scribes composed hymns in her name. Painters filled temple walls with images of her kneeling in prayer, eyes raised toward heaven, glowing with imaginary grace. Every brushstroke erased another piece of truth. The same priests who had sealed her away now stood before thousands, proclaiming, "Behold, the chaste bride, who purged her soul for the glory of our faith." The people wept not for what she endured, but for what they were told she represented. Her suffering became their sermon. They built a shrine where her chamber once stood. Pilgrims traveled from distant provinces to light candles and touch the marble floor, believing it to be sacred ground. The empire turned her prison into a temple, an irony so complete it felt deliberate. Offerings filled the altar. Gold, fruit, silk, prayers whispered by mothers begging for obedient daughters. And above it all, a single plaque read, "She obeyed and was made divine." But not everyone believed. Whispers began to circulate in the servants' quarters, about the smell that had lingered too long, about the blood stains hidden beneath the temple stones. Some said a maid had vanished the same morning the bride was found. Others swore they heard her name whispered by travelers from foreign lands, carrying fragments of forbidden truth. Years later, a scholar from across the sea came upon a sealed record, a forgotten testimony written by a palace physician. In coded words, it described a cleansing ritual gone wrong, a woman who died not of sin, but of starvation. The document was quickly confiscated, the scholar exiled for heresy. Yet copies survived, small, handwritten, smuggled between pages of trade ledgers and prayer books. A century later, an explorer visited the ruins of the old temple. Beneath the marble, he discovered a hidden space, a bricked wall concealing the original door to the chamber. Behind it, he found scratches etched into the stone. They were not random. They formed symbols, crude letters, the beginning of a name. It was hers. The empire had buried not just her body, but her voice. In official chronicles, she became Saint Avellini of 40 Days, the patron of purity and silent devotion. Every year, the empire celebrated her with parades and festivals. The air filled with music and prayer, drowning out the echoes of her real screams. The people knelt before her statue, carved from white marble, a smiling, peaceful figure holding a lily. None saw the chains carved discreetly around her ankles. But the truth does not stay buried forever. Centuries after her death, historians began piecing together fragments, censored letters, diaries from foreign envoys, and local folklore that contradicted the official version. One traveler's account described a noblewoman punished for imagined sin. Another mentioned a chamber sealed in devotion and silence. Bit by bit, the story began to shift. The saint became a victim. The empire's glory turned to guilt. Modern scholars now debate whether the so-called ritual ever held divine meaning or if it was simply a public display of cruelty disguised as holiness. Yet, the empire's legacy endures. Her image still adorns coins, her story still told as a tale of virtue, not violence. In museums and temples, her name remains holy. But behind closed archives, her truth whispers, fragile, forbidden, but alive. And somewhere, in the ruins of that ancient shrine, a single engraving survives beneath the marble altar. It is faint, carved by hands that trembled and bled, but still legible. It does not say saint. It does not say pure. It says only, remember me. The legacy of silence, 850 words. Centuries have passed, yet her story never truly ended. It simply changed its name. The empire that buried her has long crumbled into dust, but its shadow stretches across time. The same silence that sealed her chamber lives on, in different lands, different languages, under different names. Honor, purity, tradition, beautiful words used as chains. Every age finds new ways to justify cruelty. In some cultures, a woman's worth still depends on her chastity. In others, it's her silence that's demanded, the unspoken rule that obedience is love and submission is virtue. Modern palaces are smaller now, homes, institutions, laws, but the walls are just as thick. The rituals of humiliation are no longer performed before altars, but before screens, courts, and gossip. The screams are quieter, yet they echo the same agony that once filled that locked chamber centuries ago. What makes her story endure is not just its horror, but its reflection. A mirror that shows what humanity refuses to unlearn. Her cleansing was never about faith. It was about control. Her silence was never holiness. It was convenience. And every time a woman is shamed for speaking, disbelieved for suffering, or blamed for surviving, that chamber breathes again. We like to imagine progress as light pushing away the dark. But history has shown that cruelty doesn't disappear, it evolves. Where once priests spoke in divine tongues, now judges speak in legal ones. Where once chains were forged of iron, now they're made of words. Reputation, respect, tradition, and still they bind. The irony is that her story was meant to teach obedience, yet it now teaches rebellion. Each uncovered record, each forbidden letter, each historian who dared to ask what really happened, they all became her voice. Piece by piece, the silence cracked. What the empire called divine suffering, the world now calls what it truly was: systemic cruelty polished into myth. She was not the first. She was not the last. Across continents, history hides sisters of her fate. Brides buried alive for disobedience, daughters exiled for love, wives drowned for impurity. Their names were erased, their stories rewritten, their pain sanctified. Empires worshipped their corpses and feared their truths. But truth, like blood, always leaves a stain. Today, her story resurfaces in documentaries, research papers, whispered conversations, not as a tale of holiness, but as a warning, a reminder of how power wears the mask of morality, how faith can be twisted into fear, how beauty, obedience, and silence were once the trinity that defined a woman's worth, and how, in many places, they still are. When archaeologists unearthed the remnants of her chamber, they found no treasures, no relics, only stone walls smoothed by time and something faintly scratched into the surface. A name, the same one that had been erased from every record. It was her final act of rebellion, carving herself back into a history that tried to forget her. And now, centuries later, she lives again, not as a saint, but as truth, not as purity, but as proof. The world calls her story dark history, but perhaps the darkness lies not in her suffering, but in the comfort of those who watched and called it sacred. Her silence was once worshipped. Now it speaks louder than the empire that killed her, because silence, when broken, becomes thunder. She entered that room as a bride and left it as a ghost. But even ghosts have voices.